Let's start with your interest in combating disinformation. Of all the issues that you could select as a senator, how did you get interested in this one?
Well, my interest really came from my work in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And you may recall in 2014, when Russia chose to invade Crimea, they used tactics that were previously not used, which was a combination of kinetic military and disinformation. And sadly, it was very effective. They continue to do that, of course, on the eastern border of Ukraine with the conflict there and in Ukraine itself. And through the Ukrainian community here in Ohio, I had gotten involved over years in trying to help Ukraine to be able to achieve its own independence and independence from Russia in particular. And again, that's where I kept running into it and realized how serious this was from a national security point of view. Of course, we've had our own issues here in this country as well, and that's piqued my interest. So I've worked with colleagues, in particular, Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with me, to come up with a way to combat disinformation, propaganda, this use of the internet in negative ways. And we decided that it was necessary for us to figure out a way to consolidate some of the efforts of the US government and to have a better interagency response, sort of all of government response, and therefore establish what's called the GEC. And the GEC is, it's an effort to try to be sure that run by the State Department that we can have all agencies and departments providing information and then coordinate it better. So the Global Engagement Center, GEC, has now been set up. And as of the last several months, actually, they've made a lot of progress in hiring people and being able to push back. Their focus, Billy, is really on the international side, which we can talk about more. But I think a lot of the lessons learned are applicable to what's going on here, even as we go into this election and the disinformation that's out there, not just from Russia. I would say China, Iran, North Korea, and other countries are happy to try to create havoc over here and to try to, in particular, create dislocation around our elections. But I think some of the lessons from overseas, where this has been an ongoing issue, particularly with Russia and Eastern and Central Europe, are lessons that can be helpful to address it here.
So tell us a little bit about how the Global Engagement Center is responding to cyber attacks in this year, and then talk also a little bit about what their work is like overseas.
Well, part of what they do is provide a clearinghouse for all the information we're getting, say from the intelligence agencies, from our communications, the Radio Free Europe and our other U.S. entities that are trying to encourage, more interaction between other countries, particularly countries, again, like Central Eastern Europe, developing countries, and the United States. So that's part of it, is just to coordinate all of that effort. And that's been very helpful and necessary. But also what they do is they provide grants to non-governmental organizations, to NGOs overseas who are on the ground combating the disinformation and the distruths and to get, what we take for granted in this country sometimes, which is the opportunity for a free press to be able to report. We have found that some of the most effective work is not going to be done by US diplomats, but by some of these NGOs with people on the ground, like democracy advocates you will have on this show with regard to Hong Kong or Belarus, two hotspots right now. So part of it is to actually fund and help support some of these groups that are day to day trying to provide a counter to the disinformation and the efforts to influence key audiences and populations that's going on around the world. And again, we're going to focus a lot on Russia today, but it's not just Russia. China also has a very well-developed propaganda arm, probably spends billions of dollars a year in trying to persuade people that what they're doing in Hong Kong or Taiwan or the South China Sea, is appropriate, and trying to shift the blame in terms of COVID-19. So there needs to be some truth telling, and that's what the GEC is trying to coordinate overseas.
Along these lines, you gave a speech 3 years ago at the Atlantic Council where you're talking about the need for greater coordination with our own government to deal with disinformation, cyber attacks, et cetera. So how do you assess that coordination? What does Congress need to do to help it further along?
Yeah, I guess I would look at this in two areas, Billy. One is in terms of the international effort, considerable success, particularly I'd say in the last several months, really bringing on more employees, being sure the budget is adequately funded. In this year's budget, we have a big increase thanks to the administration and Congress working together. So we're getting, up and going. I will say it pales in comparison to what other countries spend. I mean, you think of RT alone, which is the Russian-backed T network, that has to be hundreds of millions of dollars alone. We're not able to come up with the kind of resources other countries have, but the resources have been increased substantially. The expertise has been brought on board, and I'm relatively pleased. Where I think we have a lot of challenges still, if you mentioned cyber attacks, is with regard to our own global attacks on our infrastructure here in this country, both government and non-governmental. I do have new legislation on that as well to try to better coordinate our efforts, and this comes out of a report that was done and an investigation undertaken by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in the Senate. I chair that subcommittee, and we unfortunately determined that many of our government agencies are ill-equipped to deal with this threat, and that frankly, they're not incentivized to do it. So our legislation, among other things, puts in place a program through the Office of Management and Budget. I used to be OMB director, you want to provide incentives to these agencies that has a sort of a risk-based budgeting. So you say, okay, what is the risk of not providing the protections against these cyber attacks on personal information on government websites, to spread disinformation? Some of the information we had was that, some foreign actors had used bots and used troll farms and other things to change, say, an SEC rulemaking. Or FCC rulemaking, I think was the actual one that was most troubling. So we need to do a better job of forcing our agencies of the federal government to come up to speed where a lot of the private sector companies have felt they need to be in order to protect themselves. That effort, I think, is still to be determined. We need new legislation. I think we need to provide new incentives. That's not exactly the same mission as the GEC, Global Engagement Center, but cyber attacks are all part of this, and we need to do a better job here in this country to be able to fight back and to be able to, provide citizens with some sense of security as to their personal information.
Disinformation, cyber attacks, all this is a really fairly recent phenomenon. So how well do you think that your fellow legislators, as well as other people, within the foreign policy community or within the government, are on top of the fact that this may be a new battleground, if you will, in terms of freedom and democracy around the world?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. The GAO has these high risk lists they do every year, and now they've put cybersecurity at the top of that list, and really have for the last decade. And I think, frankly, legislators are catching up to that. In terms of cyber attacks, we think there were about 30,000 cyber attacks alone in the last year on federal government sites, as an example. So I think we're getting there. This risk-based budget model I talked about would help. To be sure we're making proper investments in cybersecurity. In terms of the global effort and disinformation more broadly, again, we're starting to step up a little bit. One thing that I've been encouraging is that we help other countries to be able to develop their own capabilities here. I've been in Eastern Europe, as an example, talking with officials from other countries about what we're doing here with the Global Engagement Center, and they're very interested in that. Many of them have a much more acute problem than we do because they are constantly bombarded with messages. And you think about what's happening in Belarus today as we talk, they don't necessarily have the sophistication we have to be able to push back and respond at the governmental level. So I think we can also help some of these countries around the world to be able to have a more effective way to deal with it. The whack-a-mole approach, where you find a site that is obviously spreading disinformation, you try to shut that down, is often the only tool people have, and then you just have it pop up somewhere else. So it needs to be a broader effort, including educating the citizenry about this threat, and unfortunately, educating people not to believe what they see sometimes, particularly on social media, because often it is not accurate and is, spreading malicious disinformation.
Earlier in the discussion, you teased some of the various state actors that have been either responsible for or associated with some of these disinformation campaigns. I'd like to dig a little bit more into each of those. Let's talk about Russia first. What do Americans need to know about Moscow's efforts to use modern technologies? You mentioned earlier troll farms or bots or cyber attacks to undermine democracies in general, but particularly ours here in the United States.
Yeah, I think, look, the internet has been very helpful in some regards in terms of educating people. Look at the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, you'll talk about later today. I think the internet's played a key role there. But it also is a way for enemies of democracy to poison the well. And for Russia in particular, in my view, it has been a very inexpensive way for them to affect the politics and really our culture here in this country. A lot less expensive than a kinetic, approach or a military approach. And it also has the benefit to them of deniability. Now, so we know what they're doing, and our intelligence community knows what they're doing, and they brief us in Congress now and again on this. But for them, they can say, we have nothing to do with this. This is some private sector actors. So that combination of things, I think the fact that it's inexpensive and it's there's some deniability that's can be achieved is something that has therefore encouraged them to do it even more. For a while, I think it was more of the old Soviet KGB approach, and it was relatively focused and narrow. Now I think it's much broader, and I think they are happy to act as disruptors and try to make our citizens question, for instance, our electoral system, or fan the flames of racial discord. And our intelligence communities have discovered this, and we just need to be aware of it as a country, push back on it. And as I said, to shut down some of the worst sites and some of the worst actors, but we also just have to have a broader sense of education about it. So I don't know, Chris, you're an expert in this area, what you think, but I think frankly, they're not going to stop it until we go on the offense also. And that means, pushing back and, not just trying to avoid cyber attacks by putting up defensive measures, but also when they attack to attack back in the cyber warfare game. That's what I hear from the experts.
Thank you, Senator. Kind of sticking with Eastern Europe, you've mentioned Ukraine, you've mentioned Belarus, I think about the Baltics. They've been a hotbed of disinformation activity. What do Americans need to know about the activity there? And I know you've mentioned a little bit already, but also how are we engaged with allies in the region to combat what's going on there, and why should we combat it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very important to realize that this is, the warfare of the 21st century. It's not the traditional warfare you might think with tanks and bullets, although that's certainly happening on the eastern border of Ukraine. People are dying every week. But there's also this, as I said earlier, when I saw what happened with regard to Crimea, I saw clearly that this was not just about military, this was also about disinformation and combining all these forces together. So we need to know this is the new national security threat that has to be faced. My own view, for what it's worth, is that NATO can play a huge role here and should play a bigger role. NATO's already engaged and involved somewhat, and not all these countries are NATO countries. One reason that I'm very pleased that Ukraine has taken the next step, toward becoming a member of NATO is that then NATO can provide them more help. And that would be the same with regard to other countries in the area like Belarus. Until that happens, I think we're not adequately using all of our allies. The Atlantic Council voted in Ukraine as a member of NATO's Enhanced Opportunity Partner Program recently. And that means they're, as is the case of Finland and Georgia, Jordan, Sweden, other countries, they're now on track to become part of NATO. I think that's really important. It's the most effective multilateral organization in the world, I believe. And I think common defense and standing up for our international norms must include now, this issue of disinformation, propaganda, and cyber. And so my hope is that that's part of our response, is that we can reinforce with NATO the need for us to step up as allies together and fight this together, just as we would fight, expansionist military policies. So I think that's part of the answer here, Chris.
Senator, moving away from Eastern Europe and looking at China, as you said, they seem to be kind of upping their game in terms of their disinformation campaigns. And I'm curious, is that the same as what Russia is trying to do? Are we seeing them try to sow discord in our democracy, or is there some other intent? Is it more looking at strengthening their global hand? And I think of the pandemic as a recent example. How would you assess what the differences are between powers?
Yeah, again, what the experts tell me is that it's a massive undertaking in China. They spend billions of dollars on it, but it is different in kind, and that would be that it may be less about disrupting our democracy and more about putting China in a good light. More recently, it has been about, I think, two issues. Taiwan is always an issue. The South China Sea is always an issue and will be going forward. But the two more recent ones are Hong Kong. And again, you'll have some experts to talk about what they have done to try to provide not just a sort of propaganda message on this, but really true disinformation that has been targeted not just at the people of Hong Kong, but the global community to try to create more sympathy for what they're doing. And they've had some effect there and some success. And the second one is how they're treating ethnic minorities. We know about the outrageous activities with regard to the Uyghurs and the fact that there are these camps, what they would call, I think, worker retraining camps, which we might term as, prison camps for hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. This is amazing. This is happening in the 21st century. So they want to put that in a different light. Recently, with regard to Tibet, they have stepped up their actions there, probably in somewhat similar ways with the Uyghurs, just being more aggressive at dealing with, the Tibetan people who are not Han Chinese. And again, this is a religious conflict as well as a cultural conflict. And so they want to shift attention from that. They want to change the dynamic, and they're trying to convince the rest of the world that what they're doing is perfectly legitimate. I hope the world doesn't fall for it, but we have to be able to push back with allies and explain what's actually going on. Recently, a couple of European countries, I believe, have stepped up their efforts to provide sanctions with regard to these human rights abuses. So I'm not saying that it's working particularly well in the developed world. I think people know what's going on, but frankly, in some of the developing world, I think it's having some effect. So I think it's different in kind. Not that they wouldn't be happy to disrupt our elections and make things more difficult for us generally, but I think a lot of what they're doing, as I understand it from the experts, is more trying to portray China in a different light.
And lastly, Senator, before I turn it back to Bill, we always think about, I think, Russia primarily as Americans, and then China, Beijing as the instigators of these disinformation campaigns. But what about a country like Iran? How sophisticated is its disinformation network and activities, and what is its intent?
Well, Iran is actually pretty effective at this. Again, it's a centrally directed country and economy, and so they're able to do things that a China or a Russia could do in relatively quick order. And specifically, I would say with regard to COVID-19, our understanding, and this is all publicly available information, is that they are a hotbed of COVID-19 infection, and yet sending out misinformation and disinformation that is just the opposite. And so that's more about them, again, changing their image in the world. And I suppose, that it's been effective in some places, but I think, frankly, their own population has other sources of information apparently, and aren't believing everything that the government is telling them. And that's one reason they've got the internal dissent. But they've actually held large-scale public events, we're told, around the country to sort of, provide disinformation. And ironically, these events have created more spread of COVID-19, as an example. So they're trying, and I think they are, again, trying to mislead both their own people and the global community, particularly countries in the Middle East, and trying to expand their influence through disinformation. So, yeah, it's not just Russia and China; it's other countries as well. It tends to be countries that have dictatorships where they're able to do that easily.
Let me wrap us up with this question. We're weeks away from a major election. What What have we learned the most, do you think, since 2016 in terms of deterring foreign efforts to undermine our campaigns? But at the same time, what worries you most about the next few weeks?
Well, Bill, I'd say two things. One, Congress has, as you know, appropriated an unprecedented amount of money to the state election systems because we don't have a federal system in this country. We rely on the states to do it. I think the number is about $1.2 billion now that has gone out to the states to be able to harden their infrastructure to avoid some of these attacks. And I think that's been helpful. I'm in touch with our Secretary of State here in Ohio as an example. He believes it's been very helpful for Ohio to have this funding available and to upgrade the system. I will say it's very decentralized. Most states are like this. Ohio certainly is. We have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans at every board of elections in every one of our 88 counties. And ultimately, they're the decision makers on most of these issues, including the infrastructure and the hardware, as well as the software that they use. So it's not as easy to just flip a switch. And yet I think it's important that we're more engaged at the federal level with these states and ultimately with these local community boards of elections. We have a group called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, CISA, that I follow closely because I'm on the Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee, and they're under the Department of Homeland Security. We have oversight over them. And they've been very aggressive with the states this year as compared to past years. Could they do more? Probably, but they've done a lot more than ever before and provided a lot of expertise to help protect the election. So I think we've done a better job at the federal level to try to strengthen election security. I think CISA in particular has been effective at saying, what do you need? We're here to help. So we'll see. My big concern, to answer that part of the question, obviously, is the fact that we've got more mail-in voting than ever by far. And this is going to overwhelm the system to a certain extent, whether it's the postal system, which is one reason we need to keep the post office strong, or whether it's the way in which ballots are received and organized and protected and counted. So that's going to be a challenge in a lot of states. We have record levels of voting here in Ohio by absentee. We don't have the unsolicited ballots here, but we've had what we call no-fault absentee voting in Ohio for a decade now, and it's worked well. We have the ability to vote by absentee without having any reason for it. I do it every year, not knowing where my crazy schedule is going to have me in Washington or Ohio, and it works well. But we've never had this volume, so we're going to have to deal with that. But that's not so much a cybersecurity issue, I don't believe. I think it's more just a technology issue and being sure that we have the ability to count the votes fairly and to get the results out as quickly as possible. That's my biggest concern.